Welcome to the debate at Newsweek. I'm Andrew Tallman.
And I'm Celeste Headley.
And today we're joined by Ellis Hennigan, repeat offender here on the debate. New York Times bestselling author, Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist, and regular here on the debate. Also joined by Mark Meckler, CEO at Convention of States Action. Gentlemen, welcome to the debate.
Hey, good to be with you, man. Yeah, nice to be here.
So today we were going to talk about dangers of swatting. Should we change how police respond to hoax threats when they happen in our schools or maybe when they happen anywhere? And we'll also talk about LGBTQ rights, specifically at the World Cup. Is it ethical to hold an event like the World Cup in a country that might discriminate against certain groups?
But before we get to all of that, let's bring on our first guest, Mark Meckler. You wrote a piece earlier this year for The Federalist that asks the question, if leftists could rig a convention of the states, why do they oppose it? In 90 seconds or less, or 45 or 53, you pick your number, can you briefly explain what the Convention of the States is, for those who may not know, and then why people on both sides of the political divide might be interested in this?
Yeah, Article 5 of the Constitution contains the way we can propose amendments. The second way is that the states can gather when 3/4 of the states decide, and they can propose amendments, and then those amendments go out to the states for ratification by 38 states. That's what it takes to put it in the Constitution. So currently there's an effort underway by our organization to have a debate around the idea of who decides. Should folks in the states decide for themselves, or should Washington, D.C. decide for them? The reason I think that folks on both sides of the aisle should be in favor of this is because the goal is to take power away from Washington, D.C. and return it to the states, to allow folks in New York to make decisions for themselves, California, Texas, Oregon, Idaho. In other words, states have different characters socially and politically, and they should be able to make most of the decisions for themselves within constitutional bounds. This is good for folks on both sides of the ideological aisle.
Ellis, what do you think about the idea of a state convention for the revision of the Constitution as a way of decentralizing power away from D.C.?
Yeah, it sort of sounds good when Mark starts talking about it, but then I think about it. And the whole states' rights thing, so let's take power out of Washington, put it into the states. It works a whole lot better if you have never met a member of a state legislature before. My God, those people make congressmen look like geniuses. Look around the country and you tell me whether you like the things that are going on in state legislatures across the country. I come from Louisiana, as you guys know. And so I grew up with the notion of states' rights, right, which was always an excuse for opposing racial integration. And then it's popped back into my life again around the issue of abortion, where states are saying, please send it home to us. And my God, look at some of the crazy stuff these states are doing. So, yes, I hate Washington until I start looking at what some of these state legislatures are intent on doing.
Let me ask a question about the purpose of the federal government. And I'll go to you first, Mark, because there are a number of things in our system in which we have all agreed, or most of us have agreed, that it would be more efficient, more effective to have it done on a national basis, right? They're talking about interstates, the EPA, all kinds of different things that we have decided, including the military, that's probably best we don't leave that up to the states. In full transparency, look, I'm a Black Jewish woman whose great-grandmother was on a slave plantation in Georgia. I don't want the federal government leaving things like civil rights and voting rights up to states, because that's been tried and that did not work. So why would we want to make the same mistake again, to go back and leave things to states that the states have screwed up before?
Yeah, well, I'll start with, in full transparency, I'm a third-generation Jewish American. Both my ancestors on both sides of the family from Ukraine were exterminated. Essentially, they tried to exterminate our relatives in Ukraine. So literally treated as less than slaves. So we understand in our family what it means to be people subjected to persecution. I also have to push back against some of the stuff that you said, that we've all agreed on certain things. What we all agreed on is that we live under the Constitution of the United States. That Constitution actually contains 17 enumerated powers specifically designated for the United States government, for the federal government. It did not include things, frankly, like the EPA. The EPA is a creation of the federal government outside the bounds of the Constitution, justified under broad interpretation of the Commerce Clause. I expect we're going to see that pared back. every single state in the United States of America actually has the equivalent of an EPA. And I'll give you a great example. I come from California originally, though I live in Texas now. CEQA is their equivalent of the EPA. It regulates much more strictly than the EPA does. And I actually think that's a good thing because I think California should have the right to do that. And under current law, the way it sits today, a Republican president, say President Trump, could limit that ability. A Republican Congress could limit that ability. I don't think that's a good idea. I think if California wants to have stricter environmental regulations, they should be allowed to. And that's what I'm fighting for.
Well, they are. Just before I go to you, Ellis, I should say that the EPA, I think, is a good example because you have states like Ellis's Louisiana where they don't regulate very well. They have the worst air pollution in the U.S., and that affects the states around them. That doesn't stay within the borders of Louisiana. So for me, that's an example of why federal government...
But we actually have remedies for that in the system. We actually have federal courts, and states can sue other states in federal court for environmental damage. That's the way our system was set up. It wasn't intended to have overarching bureaucracies to deal with what are otherwise local issues. What you're talking about is the exception, and the exceptions were always intended to be dealt with by the federal courts and interstate litigation.
So, Ellis, what do you think?
Well, I mean, what's happened over the years is that we've dealt with bigger and different issues than our founding fathers had to wrestle with. Air pollution, as you mentioned, it is certainly one of them. But in the end, it really comes down to who you're going to trust. Right. And it's always dangerous to trust any politician. I mean, God knows there's political bodies that do things I don't like every single day. But if you ask me, and I think if you ask most people other than hardcore conservatives on this question, if you ask them, who do you trust more of a federal government or the members of the local state legislature, not just in your state, but in all the other states around the country whose actions affect you? I mean, again, go meet some of those people. I wouldn't let them cater a barbecue, much less control my the future of me and my family and the issues that I care
Well, look,
about.
I appreciate you saying that, but statistically, you're incorrect. We polled this nationally. 66% of Americans across party lines favor this idea. And frankly, I've been personally in 48 state legislatures around the country. So I'm going to venture a guess, Ellis, a lot more than you. It's where I spend the majority of my time.
Are you impressed by the fine, intelligent folks who are operating all those state legislatures?
I
they
actually
seem like
am
idiots to me, mostly.
Far more. Look, again, I don't treat people with the disdain that apparently you do. I've actually been in these legislatures. I've met people on both sides of the aisle. For the most part, most of the people that are in state legislatures are there for the right reason. They intend to serve. Their actual evidence of public service that we don't see in Washington, D.C. Most of those folks are there because they're career minded. They're getting rich while they're in Washington, D.C. That's not true of state legislators. So I place much more faith in state legislatures around the country to reflect the populations of their states than I do in Washington, D.C. And we have clear evidence of that today from both parties in Washington, D.C.
It's not an accident that the places that you guys are having the most success or places like my home region, where many legislatures have called for this, but I don't see it in many places with a lot of liberal-minded people.
Yeah, that's
not true. We just passed out of 2 committees in Massachusetts. We have a Democrat sponsor in New Jersey. We passed in Alaska. Florida is considered a swing state long before DeSantis. We passed there. Georgia's now a swing state. You would argue Georgia's in play. We passed in Georgia. So a lot of states that you would consider swing states, a lot of legislators that are Democrats are in support of this. So you're making a lot of allegations that are personal character assassinations of legislators you don't know that I actually know, and you're stating things as fact that are not facts.
Let's talk about the implications of going through with this process, because I'm very sympathetic to the argument. I prefer the idea of scaling back the federal government to something approximating its original boundaries. But the problem I have with the Convention of the States, though I think I probably lean for it, my biggest concern is it terrifies me what might go away. For example, the Second Amendment. I'm a big believer. I'm not sure if you run the experiment of start from scratch and create a new constitution today that we get a Second Amendment ratified. I'm not sure that we get a First Amendment ratified or certain portions of it. And that list is pretty extensive. I think there's a certain structure and continuity to having had these things in place for many of them over 200 years that people aren't quite willing to fully tinker with until you give them the chance. And then all of a sudden, God knows what might happen. Are you not concerned about the outcome backfiring, Mark?
Yeah, I'll be honest with you. I would be if that were the process. That's not the process. This is not about rewriting the Constitution. This is actually for proposing amendments under Article 5. And the only amendments that can be discussed at convention are those that the states give their delegations authority to discuss. And the things open for discussion at this convention are three only. First is anything that would impose term limits on Congress and federal officials, anything that would impose fiscal restraints on the federal government. So that would be things like potentially a balanced budget amendment, tax caps, spending caps. And third is anything that would limit the scope, power, and jurisdiction of the federal government. And this goes directly to what we were talking about a little earlier about things like the EPA that should be, in my opinion, under the purview of the states and not the federal government. So it's very limited in its scope. It is not a redraft from scratch. And I am, and frankly, everybody I know is opposed to that.
Yeah, and Mark, before we pull away from this, I would point out that the three things, Mark, that you mentioned are all things that are very high on the agenda of the most conservative forces in America. It's interesting that those would be the three things that you would limit it to. The last point I would make on this is that if we're going to really take a look at rewriting vast parts of our governmental system, I would suggest that now is not a really good time in history for that. There are huge divisions in our country, tremendous amount of distrust across the aisle, large numbers of political officials who are undermining the very, very concept of democracy, refusing to accept election results, or calling into question
like Hillary Clinton and
the very foundations. And
the sitting governor of Georgia.
Ellis,
you
I
have
think
your list. If I can finish, you have your list and I have my list. But I would just suggest that maybe now isn't the best time in history to expect Americans to show their most understanding and broad-based attitudes and come together on something as important as this.
The flip side of the question I was asking Mark is I often feel torn on these issues. I'd be terrified of the outcome if we allowed everything to be revised. Mark has said it's only these specific questions. But Ellis, the flip side is I'm also, I don't know, there's something about, hey, let people get together and decide. I mean, that really is the premise of democracy. And if we've got a process for producing some discussion about major issues of national importance, even though you might not think the state legislators or whoever might serve, why trust them? I'm kind of inclined to say, hey, this is the process. Let's follow it and see what happens. You don't think so?
I agree with you about the attractiveness of the slogan. I mean, it sounds good, right? We should get it as close to the people as possible. We should let 1,000 flowers bloom. I mean, all that stuff sounds great. But then you look at the impact it's having. And I mean, I think we would both agree that if you look back, say, at the last half century or so, the two big issues that were fought out on that realm have been abortion and have been civil rights, racial civil rights. And in both cases, boy, the states' rights people look horrible, I think.
I mean, one of the things that I like to do when we're having a debate about any issue is stick to the facts. And Ellis said that the things that we're proposing are things that are hot button issues among conservatives. Ellis, I just got to tell you, for 30 years, it's been polled among the American people, over 3 decades, literally, whether people want a balanced budget amendment. And that polls 80 to 85% among the American public over the last 30 to 35 years. The same, by the way, is true on term limits. It's an 80 to 85% issue over the last 30 to 35 years, polled consistently. And I can provide you with all that polling. It's not conservative pollsters. In fact, there haven't been conservative pollsters until recent times. And so these are things that are broadly looked at by the American public as popular. The last one is limiting the scope, power, and jurisdiction. And the last polling that was done on that was done by Gallup. It's a couple of years old at this point, but 72% of Americans say the federal government is too big and does too much. I think we would argue, and rightly so, on a partisan basis, on an ideological basis, about what kind of cuts there would be. Is it welfare? Is it military? What exactly? How's that fall out? But the idea that the federal government is too big and does too much, that's just wildly popular among the American people. So you're just actually statistically wrong. And I know the American people. I'm out there traveling among them every single week, 48 states in the last 3 years. These are things that the American people love.
So I just want to jump in here and make sure that we're clear that you're kind of cherry picking here, because another thing that is wildly popular among Americans is abortion rights. And there are state lawmakers limiting that to extraordinarily restrictive degrees right now. And that's one of the reasons they're pushing for a federal law to protect them. There's many other things.
But Celeste, I'm not cherry picking. This is what we're running an application on. This just happens to be the application. And frankly, I would be fully in support if folks on the left wanted to run for a convention of states and get 34 states to do an abortion amendment, I would be in favor of folks trying to do that. So I'm not cherry picking at all.
If I'm a little skeptical, because while we have record numbers of underrepresented groups in the House of Representatives, state legislatures around the country are incredibly white and male. So state legislatures tend to not represent the very demographics of the population. There's a lot of different reasons for that. So I'm a little skeptical of that. I'm also skeptical because we still haven't even been able to get the Equal Rights Amendment passed, despite broad support for it. But
there isn't broad support. There was a 7-year term put in. It's been defeated. It was actually defeated.
I'm moving on to we got to take a break, and we're going to do that. When we come back, we will ask our guests to predict the future just a little bit. We're going to talk about the upcoming midterm elections, and we'll talk about what may happen during those elections. This is The Debate from Newsweek.
Welcome back to The Debate. We're joined today by Mark Meckler and Ellis Hennigan.
And for the second topic, we will talk about the midterm elections. Who will come out on top here? Is it even useful to talk about elections as a sort of horse race, Republicans versus Democrats? So let's talk about that first. And let me go to you first, Ellis. What do you make of horse race predictions? And if it were a horse race, who wins?
Well, it's hard not to make them. I mean, there's an awful lot hanging in the balance, right? It matters in tremendous ways whether the Democrats or the Republicans control the House of Representatives or the United States Senate. It truly will determine the political agenda in this country for the next 2 years. So yeah, sometimes it seems a little dumb, but it's hard not to pay attention. Listen, history teaches us that the out party tends to do better at midterm elections, and so you have to assume that's likely to be true. The polling has shifted a bit over the months. For a while, early on, it seemed like Republicans were going to romp and just have a huge victory. Then Dems were pulling all but even. I'd say in the past couple of weeks, Republicans seem to be inching back ahead. But 3 weeks is a good ways to go, and I don't think anybody really knows.
There's a difference, as we go to you, Mark, between the results that we might be possible in the House of Representatives versus the Senate. So what do you think, Mark?
Yeah, I mean, as I look at it right now, pretty much everything Ellis says, I agree with. And you see the Republicans starting to edge back up. One of the big questions when you watch the trajectory towards an election is momentum, right? Who has the momentum when? And when we saw the Dobbs decision come out of the Supreme Court, I think there was definitely a shift in momentum that took place after that. There are a lot of predictions that the Democrats were really going to surge. In fact, we did see polling change 3-4 points over the weeks following Dobbs. That seems to have pretty much recorrected now. What you see is Republicans inching back up, and you see Republicans ahead by 2 points on the generic. That's very unusual for Republicans to be ahead on the generic ballot, and I think it portends a wave. I would predict right now, if I had to call it today, and again, I think Ellis is correct, 3 weeks, a lot can happen. Today, I would say the Republicans pick up at least 30 seats in the House of Representatives and end up with a 2-seat majority in the Senate based on what I'm seeing today.
Yeah, I was kind of curious, you guys' take on that whole issue of what's going to drive people's vote. Obviously, during the summer, there was a lot of speculation, as you say, polling and some early results in particular cases that seemed to indicate the Dobbs decision and blowback against it might be a big winning issue for the Democrats. But that seems to have faded as people are looking more at things like inflation and the cost of housing and the price of gas, all minor dribs and drabs out of the strategic petroleum reserve to the contrary. And maybe it's always going to be what we've always said in the past is the economy's stupid. Ellis, is there you think, top tier issue that's going to drive people's vote coming up in 3 weeks? Or as is already happening, early voting, right?
Yeah, I don't think there's any one. I mean, I think the world's a more complicated place now, and there's a lot of stuff going on. I think there are a couple of other things that are worth throwing into your gumbo right there, to use a hometown expression.
I'll take it.
The question of the quality of some of these Republican candidates, especially in the Senate, is definitely dragging down Republicans. If you're a Dem and you want to feel hopeful despite the historic pressure, you start ticking off some of these people who are just, I don't need to name them, but they're just rotten candidates. And some of them may squeak to victory, but Republicans would have been a whole lot better off if they found some candidates who could appeal more naturally to the middle. The other question is the overall issue of democracy. I mean, I do think there are a lot of people in the middle and certainly on the left who are worried about the future of democracy in this country. They see these election deniers on the ballot, people refusing to accept the results, whatever they say. And I do think that scares the bejesus out of a certain number of Americans. And I think if you're looking for democratic reasons for optimism, I'd focus on those two things as well.
What about the push, Mark, that was going on where Democrats were, secretly, not so secretly pushing what they considered to be more extreme candidates, Trump supporters, for example, in the primaries to win because they thought they'd be weaker in the general election? Is that strategy, which they certainly pursued and in some cases accomplished, is that going to pay off for them or is that going to backfire for them?
I mean, my read now, and by the way, again, I agree with Ellis. There are some weak candidates that were pushed forward and that won on the Republican side. Some of them pushed by Democrats for political reasons. And, it might be dirty politics, but it's politics. It's not illegal. So I think we're going to see some trouble out of that. But I also think some of them are rising. And nobody expected Carrie Lake in Arizona to be the gubernatorial superstar that she is right now. And she's just going to mow down Katie Hobbs. It's not even close. Nobody expected to see Zeldin in New York running neck and neck with Kathy Hochul. And he's a very conservative guy. We're seeing Mehmet Oz in Pennsylvania. That's a very interesting race. Not an actual real hardcore conservative. Relatively weak candidate, I would say, probably in Ellis's mind too, but against a weaker candidate, which is Fetterman. So I think there's a lot of interesting things playing out. I think we're going to see more conservatives win than people expected. A lot of that is not necessarily on the strength of the candidate. It's going to be on the strength of the wave itself.
I hate to be the only woman in a group of white males, but we have to talk about how abortion might drive people to the polls or not, because new polling, especially from the Kaiser Family Foundation, says that there is a record number of people who say that the Supreme Court's decision to overturn Roe v. Wade is actually going to motivate them to go to the polls, up at least 7 percentage points just from July. And among women, there's especially a massive number of women who are expecting to go and vote, mostly because of abortion issues. And that may be one of the things that actually determines winning or losing in races. Let me go to you first, Ellis. How do you think that Supreme Court decision might affect what happens?
Well, it's clearly a factor. I mean, there's a group of voters who are super motivated around it. Is it enough to overcome other things? We can all claim that our side is going to do great, but I don't know. It's really complicated.
Mark?
Yeah, I don't think it's enough. I mean, if you look at the rankings of what people consider most important, generally at best, abortion is coming in at fourth. It varies from state to state, obviously, and location to location. And the place where abortion ranks the highest as an issue among men or women, those are all the states that tend to be the blue states, anywhere where Republicans aren't going to win the seats. They're not going to win the Senate. And those are, by the way, the states where abortion remains largely legal and mostly unfettered in those states. So I don't think it has a big effect on the election. This election is about the economy, number one. And number two, secondarily, is crime. And for a lot of women and women who have families, they're concerned about the safety of their family. So groceries on the table, having your family safe, those are the issues of this election.
I was watching the Marco Rubio.
Just a second, Andrew. I got to push back on that just a little bit, Mark, because sure. Places like Georgia, where there is a hair-thin margin between Stacey Abrams and Brian Kemp, for example, 2/3 of Georgia voters object to the new abortion restrictions there. Even in the race between Mehmet Oz and and Fetterman, there's a huge amount of support for abortion rights and a lot of objections to the Supreme Court decision. So, we can downplay it, but there's a very good chance that those two things will end up making the difference in states that are generally swing states.
Yeah, I would just say, look, I'm happy to buy you lunch when Stacey Abrams wins the election there. That election is so far out of Stacey Abrams' reach today that we're advising people not to even pay attention to it anymore. We do get out the vote efforts all over the country. That race is done, and it's been done for a long time. Stacey Abrams can fantasize that she's still the governor of Georgia, but she never has been, and she's never going to be. It's not even close. Abortion rights or not, whether they're an issue or not in that state is no longer in play for the governorship in the Democratic Party.
So here in Florida last night, we had the Marco Rubio-Val Demings debate, the one and only Senate debate that we're going to have this year. And zingers and, hot takes aside, it was very boring because they were very standard on the issues of guns and abortion and all of this stuff. Where I thought it got really interesting is when you had the question of foreign policy. And the specific question asked was, hey, if Vladimir Putin pressed to do something, resorts to a tactical battlefield nuclear attack, something small scale, right? Not a strategic weapon. What do you think we ought to do? And what it brought to mind in the distinction of their answers was foreign policy chops and concern about that. I just wonder, we are in a place where, thinking about Ukraine, thinking about Russia, thinking about China should be top of mind for Americans. It isn't really, maybe, but does that play any factor, or do Americans say, ho hum, I'm paying too much for gas, that's all I care about, Ellis?
No, it's a factor. You're not making the case that Marco Rubio is some kind of foreign policy genius, are you?
Well, I think if you ask me my opinion, I think he did a lot better answering the question than she did. I'll just put it that way. But the question is, do voters care? Do they vote on this basis?
What I would say, first of all, I like debates. I mean, you're right. They can be filled with stilted answers and silly zingers, but they really are, unfortunately, in our system these days, the only time most viewers get a chance to look at any of these candidates in a way that is even remotely unscripted or live. And so, I want more debates, not fewer debates, even conceding all your objections to the format. Foreign policy is, yes, I think it's a pocket issue. Again, it's so easy for each of us to find an issue or two that we think is important and pretend that that's the thing that's really going to swing the election. I just don't think it's that simple. I just think we're a really, really diverse country. People care about some really dramatic stuff and are motivated in all kind of bank shot sort of ways. And I just think it's a mistake to point to one or two things and say that's it.
Mark, does any foreign policy in this election matter?
No, not really. And I just want to clarify, what I try to do is reflect not my opinion, but what I see, because again, I travel all the time. I'm with grassroots all across the country. And then I do watch the broad polling. I'm really interested in what people say they're interested in. And what you see right now, and I think it's odd. It's not necessarily correct, a good way to look at the world right now. Foreign policy is just not on people's radar. I mean, it should be. The world's in a very uncertain state. We've got a war in Ukraine that could potentially lead to a nuclear conflict. Iran is raising its head again. China is a threat. So I think there's a lot of really crazy, dangerous stuff going on in the world. But look, when people are struggling to pay their bills, when inflation is at record high, when mortgage interest rates are keeping people from buying homes, when people are deciding groceries versus gasoline, they're just not paying attention to foreign policy. And I do think it's a mistake, because I think foreign policy is really important. It's just not on the radar, broadly speaking, of the American people right now.
All right, we're going to take another quick break, and when we come back, we'll talk about public safety, schools, and this whole business of swatting that just seems to be suddenly rampant right here on The Debate at Newsweek. Welcome back to The Debate.
As mentioned, we are going to talk about swatting. These are hoax threats of a mass shooting that are meant to force law enforcement to respond.
NPR has reported about 113 of these swatting incidents between September 13th and October 5th of this year across 19 states. We've had about 5 in California Bay Area in the last week and several in Florida, especially around the Parkland trial of Nicholas Cruz.
A number of times, law enforcement response to these threats, whether real or not, is quite forceful. It can be very disrupted, very frightening, especially when we're talking about children, of course.
So the question is, if false alarms, false threats are really kind of the new normal and abuse of police response, what do we do for consequences for the people who perpetrate these hoaxes? And should police be doing anything fundamentally different in the way they handle this stuff? Let's start with you, Mark.
Yeah, I think police are going to have to adjust, and this is going to be a very difficult one. I grew up in a law enforcement family, so I know a lot of these folks. When they get a call about an active shooter, That's about as intense a moment in a police force as you're ever going to hear. They know that there are potentially victims who are already down. They know they've got a hostile combatant who's out there, who's likely heavily armed, who's going to have the tactical advantage as they come in and try to assess the situation. Adrenaline is high. Decision-making is forced to be rapid. I think they're going to have to retrain. And this is a new phenomenon. They've not faced it before. So I think there's going to be a lot of analysis of these unfortunate SWAT incidents that have taken place, how police responded, and they're going to have a whole new training regimen. As far as people being punished, I haven't heard much about people being caught for these things. It's pretty easy to do without being caught, as I understand it. I think the punishment should be swift and severe, obviously according to due process, but I think these folks got to go to jail. There has to be a very strong sign sent that it won't be tolerated.
Yeah, Ellis, I mean, it's obviously a major problem when you're responding to an incident that might not even be an incident at all, when hesitancy can be the difference between life and death. What should police do when they get these calls? How should they approach it?
Things have sure come a long way since pulling the fire alarm in fourth grade, haven't they? Yeah, this is horrible. Yes, people should be punished. Yes, we should try to catch them. Yes, it's serious business. Yes, the cops are coming with huge firepower now to respond to some of these active shooter scenes. No, there's no excusing it. There's no lessening it. And we should respond seriously. Kids, please stop if you're doing that, okay?
And I should mention that making a false police report is already illegal, although in most states it is a misdemeanor. Since you both agree on that, let's move on to something you may not agree on. Who knows? First up, the Stonewall, which is an advocacy group for the LGBT plus community in the UK, is warning people that the World Cup might not be safe for gay and trans people to attend. That's because it's happening in Qatar, and that's where homosexuality is against the law. Transgender identities are not recognized, and there's been a history of violence against members of those communities.
Yeah, so FIFA and the Qatari government said everyone would be welcome at the Cup, but Stonewall and other advocates remain concerned. Is it ethical for massive events with a widespread, in this case, global appeal like the World Cup or the Olympics, to be held in countries that discriminate against certain groups? Ellis?
I understand the concern, but I got to tell you, I'm a little skeptical on these boycotts. The whole point of international athletics is to bring people around the world together into different cultures, different legal systems, different races. And listen, lots of countries do all kind of bad stuff. And if we try to put some kind of a ethical test based on where we run a soccer match, I just think we're undermining the whole process. Listen, let's go to Qatar. Let's take them on their word that they can respond well. If they don't, if they harass people who are there, treat them badly, then they should never get another event ever again.
Mark, should we have any tests, prerequisites, human rights requirements of countries that are going to host these international sporting events?
I think it's very difficult. And I agree with Ellis. This is one of those slippery slope situations. Where exactly do you draw the line? I think there is a line somewhere. The boycott of Nazi Germany in the Olympics. Should we do something like that? I would say yes. When we say they don't treat these communities correctly, I'm not sure that's the right line. Although I have to say that this is interesting to me that people are surprised by this. Okay, homosexuality is illegal in every Muslim-ruled country on earth. They shouldn't be surprised. The surprise to me is there tends to be this intersectionality, for example, between the Palestinian community and the gay community in America. It's inappropriate because all the rights that we recognize here in America for people of those communities are not recognized in any Muslim community around the world. And I think there's a bit of irony in that.
That brings up a question about what things we do sort of sanction people for or take events away from them for, because there is a history of pulling an event from a particular country because of bad behavior, because they don't follow what are considered to be international norms. And that we will do that to protect certain communities. We will sometimes do that because someone violates human rights or civil rights of some other demographic. Why not the LGBTQ plus community, Ellis?
Yeah, I get that. And by the way, it's even more than international communities. I mean, the NCAA pulls tournaments out of states that pass abhorrent laws, and states, as we were talking before, I know Mark doesn't agree with this, but I see those legislatures passing a lot of stuff. I think it's pretty terrible. But again, I understand it at the extremes, but I just think that athletics, particularly amateur athletics, is something that listen, we got to deal with people we don't agree with. We've got to deal with people who have attitudes we don't support, including some things we find pretty terrible. That's one of the great things about athletics around the world, I think.
Mark, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, Ellis and I are generally in agreement here, and individuals don't want to go because they're objecting to the human rights stance or the stance against any community of a particular country. I think that's up to the athlete, depriving other athletes of that opportunity. Generally speaking, I'm opposed to that. I agree. I try to put athletics outside of politics to the extent that we can.
Yeah, by the way, I don't want to support that Saudi Arabia Golf League, though. I mean, that's like, you guys, please don't go there as far as I'm concerned.
And kind of back to your point, Mark, you made before, is should this be a surprise to anybody? Look at, for example, religious liberty, same kind of thing. We've kind of accepted that many of these countries are very suppressive of religious liberty. Okay, we're still going to have the things for suppressive of female rights. Okay, and then this is just sort of the new one that we're more concerned about. And I guess we live with the idea that, life, as Ellis says, you're going to have to deal with people you don't agree with. And sometimes sports is meant to be bridging those gaps or ignoring them, really actively ignoring them. One more thing I want to ask you guys about, just for fun, since we are all right in the middle of dating. We are all decades out of dating, I think. But we had a really interesting article at Newsweek where the discussion was red flags, the things you see early in the relationship that you really maybe should pay more attention to, that you didn't pay attention to, that later on you decide, oh, crap, why didn't I look at that?
Deal breakers.
Yeah, exactly. And you talk yourself into believing that a little too touchy, no big deal, or a little too much telling you I love you or whatever. So since both of you are well down this path like I am, the question is, red flags early in relationships, any that stick out to you that you say, no, pay attention to that. That's bad stuff. Mark?
Asking the guy that's been married almost 30 years this question is just unfair. So you'd have the same results if you asked me about nuclear physics or something. Like, I guess here's what I would say as a guy that's been married almost 30 years. If you see red flags early, get out, because the goal is to be together for your whole life. At least that's my goal. I dated with the idea that I was going to end up married. That's what I wanted to do. And so even 30 years ago, if I saw a red flag, I would think, if it's a red flag now, it's going to be a big old gigantic red flag 2 years or 5 years or 10 years from now. So if you see something that's really making you uncomfortable, I would say get out while the getting's good.
So Eddie Murphy's advice to people when they go in the house that looks great, but there's a ghost, get out. Ellis, how do you pay attention to red flags or not early on?
I've got a good one for you. Treating waiters shitty. If you're going out with somebody who is rude to the staff, bad sign. People do that early in a relationship. They say, he's just particular. He didn't get it the way. You know what? Never, ever, ever go on a second date with someone who treats the waiter poorly.
Undertips them.
Same way. It's a sign of bad character.
I totally agree. Andrew, what's your what are your deal breakers?
Oh, well, I just think the general analysis Mark gave is exactly right. Right. When people are first dating, they tend to want to hide their bad stuff. And if you still see it, that means it's extra bad. Like, you don't realize how bad it is. And since you're motivated to get something out of the relationship, you tend to want to suppress your awareness of the flags. So both sides, if something kind of raises your hackles early in the relationship, pay attention to that. And, the advice I always gave to people when I was teaching about this stuff was, look, if there's stuff that you think is a problem now, assume it's going to be 10 times worse when you're married. Can you still live with it? And if the answer is no, then, you got to leave.
I used to say when I was in college that if a guy didn't like dogs and Stevie Wonder, it was probably a red flag. But we do have to wrap up. I mean, you can dislike one of them, but not both. In any case, you can find every episode of The Debate wherever you get your podcasts or at newsweek.com.
And if you have thoughts you want to share with us on any of the topics we discussed today, leave a comment at newsweek.com or send us an email at thedebate@newsweek.com.
That's all the time that we have on The Debate today. I'm Celeste Headley.
And I'm Andrew Tallman, and we want to thank our good guests, Mark Meckler and Ellis Henneken, for joining us today. Thank you for listening to The Debate from Newsweek.
I'm here live in Philadelphia at the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. When you hear the phrase lives, fortunes, and sacred honor, these are the folks we should think of, those who anonymously gave their lives. Well, today you have a chance to volunteer. You need to volunteer for conventionofstates.com, the movement that's going to save the country. These folks are willing to step up and give everything. We need you to give just a little bit. Go to conventionofstates.com and volunteer today.